I'm at the NeMa conference in Athens, where among other topics that we've been discussing at length is the imminent arrival of T2S, the single settlement platform for Europe. I'm joined now by Alan Cameron, who is Head of Relationship Management at BNP Paribas Securities Services, by Rich Scavetta, who is T2S Program Director at Citi, and by Graham Ray, who is Product Manager, Investor Services at Deutsche Bank. Gentlemen, one thing we have learnt in the last 2 or 3 days we've spent here is that T2S is not going to deliver the cost savings which were promised when this product was launched way back in July 2006. What's gone wrong? If anything has gone wrong, maybe the product has just evolved in a way we hadn't expected.
Well, maybe I can answer that, Dominic. I think the first thing to say is that we do think it will give cost savings for cross-border transactions. But you're right, it's much less clear if there will be cost savings for domestic transactions. But the industry can still get cost savings out of the project because it comes with a lot of harmonization. And if we can change our operating models to get process simplification as a result of that, then it can still deliver cost savings to the industry, not just in the way that was originally intended.
I mean, just to add to that, I think the other consideration is it's not only the €500 million the Eurosystem has spent building the platform, but it's the hundreds of millions of euros the CSDs have spent to adapt their systems to T2S, and the tens, at least, millions of euros other participants have spent. So I think in the medium term, we should see some of the costs come down when we get over the implementation costs. But in the near term, there's a lot of upfront investment to work our way through.
We're talking there, Rich, just to be clear, only about cross-border savings. We're not talking about domestic savings. What's going to happen to domestic settlement costs? Sorry,
my comments were about domestic. So I agree.
Oh, they were.
On cross-border, there are savings. And I think in domestic, there will be savings in the medium term, but not until we eat through some of the implementation costs.
And the thing I'd like to add to it is we need to sort of step back a little bit as well. We're imminent to wave one occurring. Absolutely, as Alan said, the way people are going to optimise that cost saving is probably from looking at the way they use T2S. That actually means looking at the efficiencies of their operating model. But T2S does go out to wave 4. And in designing that operating model, there's probably a slight journey that people are taking between maybe agent bank consolidation or looking at the different models and executing on them during the T2S journey. So to really Richard's point, I think the cost savings are going to occur, but they're not going to be imminent. They're going to come over the varying different waves of when people execute on the operating model they feel is most beneficial to their business.
So just to add to that, we really don't know what the CSD pricing is going to be. And even the CSDs don't really know what their pricing is going to be. And we'll have to wait to see how their business models develop and how they pass on any advantages to the users. I guess the one thing we will see is probably a rebalancing of costs between settlement and asset servicing. And generally speaking, today's settlement has probably subsidized asset servicing across Europe. And that probably will not continue in quite the same way as it has in the future.
But we do know the settlement price is going to be 15 euro cents, and then there's all sorts of additions to that for matching and allocations and so on. So will that be under the control of the domestic CSDs, or will this be set at flat prices by T2S itself?
Well, I think often the confusion is the 15 euro cents or 20 odd euro cents is the price that T2S will charge the CSDs, who are its clients.
So they can make up anything.
The CSDs will set the pricing for their clients, which are us around the table. So everyone gets confused, think they're going to get charged the 15 cents, when in fact that's what the clients of T2S will get charged.
So it will be at least 15 cents.
At least.
And we even heard that over the last couple of days that there's a different approach by different CSDs, how they want to communicate currently what their schedule is going to be. But to Alan's point, we only know probably imminent and upcoming, not through the whole wave implementation of T2S, what those CSDs are going to be for the clients of this.
And I think I'm right to say that the T2S price schedule does go through a series of other alternative services you might or might not want to buy. Are those entirely voluntary, or are those going to be compulsory additions to the 15 cents? I'm talking here of matching and allocation, which also have fixed prices attached to them, don't they?
It'd be hard to live without some of these things.
That's what. But are they setting the price at the domestic level as well, or is that just the price they're going to be charging to the CSDs?
I mean, that would be a component of the domestic level pricing. But the other area where we'll look for cost savings is around liquidity. And a few years ago, nobody really measured liquidity. Nobody paid a great deal of attention to it. But right now, it's very central to everyone's thoughts. And the hope is that with auto collateralization coming with T2S, that our liquidity requirements will be fulfilled with much less collateral than previously. And that could be a huge saving for the industry.
I have noticed the European Central Bank has talked up auto collateralization quite a lot in the last year or two. Is this a measure of they have not achieved, the pricing isn't where they'd quite like it to have been when they set out on this journey? But what Alan says, it sounds like the savings are genuine anyway.
Indeed, and I think that one of the advantages, since T2S is a multi-market settlement venue, today where we have auto-collateralization in some markets like Italy, it's proven to be very effective in reducing liquidity needs for the Italian market, but it's been a very domestic silo. You can only have a savings in Italy. Now, as multiple markets join the platform, and you can link up Italy and other fixed income held in Southern European CSDs to fund equity purchases in Germany and ESIS, et cetera, it becomes very interesting as it becomes cross-border and should really help to optimize liquidity.
I mean, it's really important, not just from the cost savings point of view, but if there was to be another credit crunch, then auto-collateralization would make settlement in Europe much more robust.
Because we get this effectively a single pool of collateral within the Eurozone, so you can use assets in any one market to collateralize an exposure in any other market. And who's really going to eat the benefit of that? Is it going to be the custodian banks, or is it going to be their clients, or going to be a mixture of both?
A mixture of both. I mean, the custodian banks should save from that, but our clients nowadays are being asked to put capital up against liquidity. So this will lessen the liquidity requirements as provided by agent banks, and they should therefore save on their capital allocations as a result. So, I mean, quite honestly, auto-collateralization should be a good thing all round.
I think the whole, when we move away from that headline price that was talked about over the last couple of days and we concentrate on the functionality of T2S, when we talk about pricing, we're talking about the end-to-end chain. So actually, when you look at the auto-collateralization or you look at the way you can manage the central bank activities going forward, the platform is there to be used. If we use it effectively, there should be a value from an overall price, in different periods of time and when clients or agent banks are executing on the applicable model for them.
Right. Now, Rich, Graham's mentioned functionality. One functionality it doesn't have is it's purely a settlement platform. It has no asset servicing functionality. In a sense, we've all sort of woken up to this quite late in the day, that assets do need to be serviced in terms of corporate actions, income collection, proxy voting, tax reclaims, whatever else. So who else is going to do that apart from the custodian banks? Do you expect that division of labour between the custodian banks and T2S as a settlement platform to change over time? In other words, are we going to get more of a DTCC for Europe? Will T2S gradually creep into asset servicing? Will it start eating your lunch?
I think it'll be a while before we see that happen. And I also think if we went back 10 years and asked ourselves again, what was the big problem in the European post-trade space, it wouldn't have been settlements. We might not have embarked on this project, might have tried to tackle asset servicing where things are much more manual and you have much more chance of losses. However, I think that was a little bit too difficult to start with, so we started with the easier piece settlements, and eventually I think we'll move into the asset servicing space, but I don't see it in the next 2 to 3 years.
And I think you have to add into that functionality the level of expertise we have in that type of process with people, where they're located, how they take actions against the asset servicing chain. So to a dimension, you could say this is creating complexity by the decoupling. There's obviously exercises that run in parallel under the Target 2 Securities initiative that give benefit in the asset servicing space around harmonisation. But actually you could say for the initial outset, it introduces a level of complexity. But even if we look to different stages of where this could go, I think the people element in particularly the voluntary world and the actions that are required really give value in having settlements put first, but ensure that actually from an agent bank community or a service provider, the expertise in that function is key and critical for the success of Europe going forward.
Well, Alan, Graham mentions the fact that this looks like adding complexity, this decoupling of settlement and asset servicing. Well, that's what it does, because if you don't know who owns what and when they own it, it's quite difficult to service the asset, isn't it? How do you solve that problem?
Well, I guess first of all, for the vast majority of clients will not see a decoupling of the settlements and asset servicing. They will go through an agent bank that will be responsible for both. and they will still get an integrated product from that agent bank. But you're absolutely right. For a small number of very large clients, they are looking at taking more control of their own settlements, and they're left with the problem about how to get the asset servicing provided. And generally speaking, they look to the agent banks to provide that. That's when it gets rather complicated, because then the asset servicer has to be completely up to date with the transaction flow. So in effect, multiple parties are having to pass information about amongst each other. And yes, I mean, it will be complicated, and we'll need some work to get it to work properly. I'm sure it can be done. Whether it will be particularly economically advantageous, I think, remains to be seen.
The complexity will add cost. Is that your expectation too, Rich?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Alan. People don't necessarily take into account all of the additional messaging, multiple parties having to keep track of the same information, different parties at different institutions that used to be under one house having to be able to communicate with each other in order to perform the asset servicing effectively. So I think some of the hidden costs in there aren't fully considered. And I think to the point we touched on earlier with pricing about in the current environment, settlement somewhat subsidizing asset servicing, I think some people look at their bill from an agent bank and look at the settlements and the asset servicing fee and assume that the settlements is going to go away if they insource it, and they'll be left with that very small bill for asset servicing. And when, in fact, we do the bottoms-up cost for asset servicing, it paints a very different picture.
Graham, you seem more generous in your interpretation of the cost and complexity.
I think actually we answer the question in some ways ourselves, because we see large institutions looking towards that type of model. So in their analysis, this isn't a short-dated analysis they've performed, it's a long-dated review. So they obviously ultimate benefits. So I think to the pure way we looked at custody, we're seeing the account structures, we're seeing the operating processes, the operating models, we're seeing the dynamics change. So I think actually it's paramount about ensuring from our perspective that we can achieve the commercial benefit that both institutions need, both from a provider and a buyer. And I think there is the opportunity to maximise that with T2S. It's just a journey to ensure that the model gives the value to the level of the service within the value chain that you require or provide.
Now, one additional cost that may emerge through the system measure CSDR, with penalties for failing to settle through buy-ins. We've seen some quite alarming numbers given for the cost of that. The number put out by AFME, I think, was 6.3 billion euros a year, which is a considerable tax on the industry if it ever comes to light. Most of it arising, I imagine, in the bond market, which could have an effect on liquidity in that market as well, imposing further costs. How worried should we be about the cost of settlement failure penalties?
What worries me about it, Dominic, is not so much the cost of the penalties, but the change in the relationship that it will make between the agent bank and their client. Because it will be, if it goes through as currently proposed, it's the entity that has the account at the CSD that will become responsible for the buy-in. Right. So it would mean that the agent banks will be providing a credit service more like they do when they're a GCM for all OTC transactions. And that will be a hard credit exposure to monitor, and certainly a hard one to price and cost as well.
Has experience of buy-ins in other markets, I mean, Taiwan has been famous for this for years now, taught us anything about how to manage that, taught custodians anything about how to manage that risk?
Well, I think to carry on from what Alan said, to be honest, to achieve it, you need to have a standard platform. So in having that standard platform across Europe, it should be the opportunity to put the over-the-counter market onto it. I think the interesting dimension, as Alan brings out, though, is that contractual relationship that you end up entering into. When you look at other markets or you look at other products that are more in the clearing space, it's very clear when that contractual relationship lies, and to the extent of that contractual relationship, how you resolve it. Now we're looking to change the dynamics of a market which, from providing a service, contractually is going to entice you into a different level of depth with your client than historically would have had, which is going to change fundamentally terms and conditions and how you perceive that level of exposure that you're undertaking.
And because it's credit, even if it's only a sort of contingent liability, it has a capital cost, presumably.
That will have to be decided. That will have to be decided.
So this could be a significant increment.
Yeah, I mean, the worry is not just the cost. The worry is can you measure it?
That's the key. Yeah. Being able to identify it and measure it, and then charge appropriately for it.
Measure the risk, you mean?
Yeah,
Yeah. Assess it. And any practice will tell us that, I assume.
absolutely.
Yeah. Now, we've talked quite a lot about costs and where they're going. One expectation which everybody shares is that there's going to be consolidation as a result of T2S, consolidation both of custodian banks and of CSDs. What do you think ultimately is going to drive or trigger that consolidation? I imagine there'll be different drivers for custodians and CSDs. What were your guess as the trigger for CSDs, Alan?
For CSDs, well, we've been talking about CSD consolidation for as long as I can remember. And in actual fact, we have more CSDs now than ever before.
Yep.
And we may even have some more in the future. But we still need consolidation of...
Some are disappearing, of course.
Yeah. yeah. I guess there's a couple of things that may help with that. I mean, we often talk about CSDR and giving the issuers the right to choose which CSD the securities go into as something that might trigger it. I guess the competitive pressure that might come through T2S may help as well, but to an extent that has been watered down by T2S having a flat pricing structure. Mm-hmm. So I think it's going to take a little while before we see it.
But in the short term, would you expect, because they've lost this settlement revenue, would you expect CSDs to put their prices up?
I think we'll see CSDs rebalancing their fee schedule to recoup some of the lost revenue from the settlement side. And I think...
I like the word rebalancing.
Rebalancing, yeah.
Rebalancing. But honestly, a few NeMas ago when we mentioned that...
So that means one up, one down.
that asset servicing was going to go up, I think no one really accepted it. And I think now, a few years on, people accept that that's probably a reality, that the cost of asset servicing is...
Dominic, I think we all have to be honest with ourselves, right? How we've priced custody as a whole historically, if we really stepped back, did we price the right activity? Settlements in the European markets, times in a T+3, the time cycle, the level of complexity of each market, has it improved over years? Without a shadow of a doubt. So were we truly pricing the settlement, or were we pricing or giving the price for the credit that was being extended? So to turn, I've heard over the panel discussions over the last 2 days that there's this now dynamic review at looking at the complexity of asset servicing and getting the right price for it. Well, because of T2S, with the exception of decoupling, we haven't changed asset servicing. Mm-hmm. We haven't suddenly introduced new asset types or activities that are occurring. So I think we have to recognise that the way we need to look at the pricing going forward is a level of transparency, but pricing for the right service that we're providing or the right asset that we're providing, which may be liquidity, may be a function.
I mean, to get your pricing right, you need truth and reconciliation. And the truth is a very hard thing to come to. And I think we all discovered during the downturn that a lot of our costs, which we thought were marginal, turned out to be fixed, and they didn't go away when the volumes went down at all. Mm-hmm. So getting to the truth of your costs is very difficult. But even if you can do that, you need something that somebody can reconcile. Mm. And we really lack an industry way of moving to a more complicated and more accurate fee structure, because it would be just so hard for clients to reconcile it. And at the end of the chain, a lot of the global custodians are still just charging on a basis point to their clients. So it's a long way to go before we can get into more complicated and more accurate pricing structure.
So I think we have a sort of clear trigger path, if you like, for CSDs, which is that initially they've lost their core settlement revenues, have probably put their prices up to rebalance, as you put it. But once CSDR kicks in and the issuers have the right to issue their securities into any CSD they choose, there's going to be fierce competition on price for that. And once certain CSDs start losing their domestic franchise, it's going to be very difficult for them to carry on. And that will be the trigger for consolidation in that sector. The answer I'm hearing on the custodian banks is a bit more complicated than that. Prices you thought, Graham was saying we had a pricing structure which was probably not ideally suited to the environment we're going into. And you were saying, Alan, that we're going to have to suck it and see and find out over time what our true fixed costs actually are. Or have I misunderstood you?
So I didn't quite catch your question there, Dominic.
My question is, what is going to trigger consolidation among custodian banks?
Well, I think the competitive elements that T2S will bring into settlements will help. But I don't see anything that makes me think that we're in for a great deal of consolidation in the immediate future. We've already consolidated so much that only really are effectively, well, there's 3 people around this table. There's not that many custodian banks left in Europe to consolidate amongst.
And we seem to be the 3 always talking about T2S. I agree to Alan's point. Take the numbers away and take the volumes that are going through the CSDs from a market participant at sub-custodial level, you'll find you're going to hit a point which is a very high percentage that's going through certain organisations. So the dynamics of T2S that maybe change is the breadth of coverage. But again, you'll get to a point where you'll probably find that 80-90% of activity is going through a certain number of CSDs that are participating and the residuals going through the other. But obviously as a solution and a region, it's really became, T2S is now a market. And that changes the sort of dynamics of coverage that we would have looked at historically.
I think what you will see is that the barriers between a direct custodian and a global custodian become much more blurred, and the ability to package these services together will be very important in the future. So,
sorry.
I was also going to say, I mean, T2S is a scale game, and it is going to favour players that have large scale, and I think you're going to see, even less so than consolidation, business moving away from a traditionally domestic European bank that may have built an international custody business on the back of what they were able to do, not being able to offer other T2S services. I think you're going to see more consolidation into multi-market providers. Of course I would say that given this around the table, but I believe it as well.
But you yourself said this morning, Alan, that you in the industry there is, it's almost an indisputable fact that the return on equity is not always exceeding the cost of equity these days, thanks to the various capital measures that have been taken and the declining profitability of the industry. So we've got to look at cost cutting here and gains on, which you were referring to earlier, gains on liquidity as the way to make this a profitable business for the few banks that are left in it to continue with.
well, I mean, my comments this morning were mainly about investment banking, where I think it's more acute than it is in transaction services. Mm-hmm. But sure, there are problems in transaction services and security services as well. But I think for the banks that are in it today, they're making a reasonable return. And the fact that they've been able to give a stable revenue flow to the banks that they're part of throughout the crisis has been very much appreciated. They've also been generally liquidity providers for the banks. So there are attractive things about being in security services still today.
I'm glad to hear it. One last question, because I think it's pretty clear that we're going to get CSD consolidation probably much sooner than we get any further consolidation in the banking sector. Can the CSDs save themselves by turning themselves into global custodians, Rich?
I think several of them are trying, and maybe some of the larger ones have a better chance of succeeding, but I don't see the smaller ones having a chance at that. I mean, it's a rather different paradigm, being a global custodian versus being an issuer CSD. I think it's a difficult transition to make, and some organizations that have experience in that space may ultimately be successful in it, but I'm not sure that many will.
And it's the different dynamics, as Rich alludes to, of the functions they're servicing, right? And the level of connectivity that a global custodian needs, whether it's in the sub-custody or the ancillary products that they also provide, versus the sort of functionality and stability that you would have looked at from a CSD providing historically. So you're going to see lines blur on where certain functions cross over, and we truly know, maybe in the collateral space you can see that very clearly already historically. But I think our identities are starting to continue to take their shape of where the global custodial function is the sub-custody function and the CSD.
Does it ever make sense for, before you address that question, Alan, because I'm interested to hear what you think, does it ever make sense for a global custodian to acquire a CSD? We've seen these decisions being reversed in some cases, but not in others. Is there some logic to that? Is one way these CSDs could save themselves as in effect to merge into global custodian entities?
My personal view, and I'll take this as my personal view, we have, I think Phil Brown covered it really well in his panel. We have disruption in the market. This is a disruptive process to something that's been quite core, fundamental for a number of years. So actually I think the aspirations that we have is first, we should actually just deal with the disruption, because there is so much complexity in whether you want to be a CSD, whether you're in the sub-custodial space, you set up an infrastructure that, yes, has technology, but has people. and those people have been located to give the expertise on the ground. And exactly the same complexities that having a global custody network alludes to. So from a personal perspective, I think the aspirations that maybe some institutions have shown and direction now taken has shown the complexity when you actually start to look at building.
Mm-hmm. Too soon to say, to Alan, to my original question, can the CSDs save themselves by becoming global custodians?
Well, not many of them can. I mean, Europe has been a graveyard for global custodians over the years, and those that had business models built around local franchises failed to build the scale that they needed to compete with the big international players. So for most of them, it would be a terrible waste of resources to go down that route. And there's valuable work that we need them to do to be a bridge between the corporate world and the capital markets. So there's other things for them to do. And I hope that they make the right choices in developing the right products for the future. On your question about custody banks buying CSDs or building them, it's quite hard to see. I mean, they come with a lot of regulation, and under CSDR, it looks like the cash movements would have to go through a limited purpose bank, and it's a very limited purpose bank indeed. So you would have to not just have a new CSD, you would probably have to have a new bank as well. This all becomes very, very expensive, and it's kind of hard to see.
It's a reminder, isn't it, that this is actually a very unique project. I don't think anyone's ever tried to build a single CSD across multiple jurisdictions before. So you've got a lot of natural complexity, all the national interests, all the national utilities there, everybody wanting to hold on to it. The only way to find out what the solution is to go through the process. I guess I think that's what you were saying, Graham.
Yeah, look, this is not a CSD. It's a settlement engine that the CSDs are using. But I think you hit on, and Richard brought it up slightly earlier. Why did we maybe tackle settlement? Because the interested parties in it are probably to a lesser degree than if we tackle asset servicing, which brings another very interesting actor in the issuer space into that discussion of how we get harmonisation across. So I think we need to let the process play out and then look at what the additional steps are.
Well, I mean, it's worth remembering what the original purpose of T2S was, and it seems a long, long time ago, but the discussion and the debate was between an integrated and an interfaced movement of central bank money and securities. So it does solve that core problem that was there.
It's about building a single European capital market at bottom, isn't it?
It's
a better integrated one, should we say?
It's a step towards that, a major step towards that, yeah.
And how long do you think we must stop now, actually, but what would be your guess as to how long it's going to take before we get a stable combination of custodians and CSDs in Europe? Are we talking 5 years, 10 years? What would be your guess? 7 years, 10, 15?
Well, as to who the players will be?
Yeah, let's say we end up with 4 CSD groups and...
On the custodian side, I think we're kind of there, to be quite honest. I don't see any of us or HSBC making a change, really, in the main ones. I think it's kind of happened. On the CSD side, I think the CSDs might find that they have another role to play in life, which could be connecting the greater public to the capital markets in some way in the domestic market. So I think they might find they have other missions to take on.
So they might survive by reinventing themselves. What's your guess, Graham? How many years are we looking at before we get the stable combination?
Look, I personally look out to 2020, and I think that we will see that stability we see today, right, with the number of CSDs that are joined T2S. Maybe we see an extension of that. From an agent bank, I completely agree with Alan's comments. So I think probably post-2020, we will either see the reshaping of services that are being provided by particular institutions, or then we may see some consolidation into that. But I come back to my point that I think actually we see the consolidation of volume already today in a majority of the CSDs across the T2S space and in a majority of agent bank network.
Yeah, we kind of know who the winners are, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think you need a few years of live T2S operation, so post-2017 to really shake out everyone's role and where consolidation may happen.
So we sort of know the end result, but we need to wait and see. Alan Cameron, Graham Ray, Rich Scavetta, thank you very much.
Thank you.